Elias sat at the polished mahogany table, the wood cold and unforgiving beneath his forearms. It was a table built for pronouncements, for declarations of power, not for quiet family dinners. The dining room of the Blackwood estate was a cavern of opulent silence, broken only by the sharp, metallic clink of silver on porcelain. Each sound was an indictment, a reminder of his otherness in this world of inherited wealth and effortless cruelty. He kept his eyes fixed on his plate, a swirl of expensive food he could not taste. Across from him sat Richard Blackwood, the patriarch, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Beside Richard was his wife, Eleanor, a woman sculpted from ice and disapproval. Her gaze swept over Elias not as a person, but as a smudge on her otherwise pristine life. And next to Elias was Clara, his wife. She was the reason he was here, the beautiful, brittle architect of his slow, grinding humiliation. For 5 years he had been her project, her charitable act of rebellion against a world that had given her everything. She had picked him, a simple librarian with a love for dusty books and quiet afternoons, and tried to mold him into a man worthy of the Blackwood name. She had failed. He had refused to break, refused to become the empty, polished shell she desired. Now the project was over. "Elias," Richard began, his voice smooth and dangerous, like a stone skipping over a frozen lake. He placed his fork down with deliberate precision. "We have something to discuss." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a dreadful anticipation. Elias felt the gazes of the entire family, Richard, Eleanor, Clara, and her smug brother Julian, converge on him. He was a specimen under a microscope. "We feel this has gone on long enough," Eleanor said, her voice a thin, reedy whisper that cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "This, arrangement." Section. Elias said nothing. He had learned long ago that his words were worthless here. They were just sounds that interrupted their monologues. Clara finally looked at him, her expression a careful mixture of pity and resolve. It was a performance, and like all her performances, it was flawless and utterly devoid of heart. "What my parents are trying to say, Elias," she said, her voice unnaturally gentle, "is that this isn't working. It was never working." She reached into her designer handbag, which sat on an empty chair beside her, as if it were an honored guest. She pulled out a crisp, cream-colored envelope. It was thick and important-looking. It was not, however, the first important envelope he had seen that day. Another one, heavier, and made of a strange, fibrous paper, was tucked into the inside pocket of his worn jacket. He had received it that morning from a courier sent from a law firm he had never heard of. He had been too consumed with dread about this dinner to open it. Clara slid the envelope across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. It stopped just short of his water glass. It was a calculated distance, forcing him to reach for it, to show his subservience. "These are for you," she announced, her voice gaining a theatrical tremor. "It's for the best, for both of us." Julian, who had been watching with a smirk playing on his lips, let out a short, derisive laugh. "Don't look so glum, mate. Think of it as being paroled." Elias stared at the envelope. He knew what it was. The finality of it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. "We've been very generous," Richard added, leaning forward. Clara insisted. "There's a settlement check in there that will be more than enough for someone of your means. A fresh start." The condescension was suffocating. They spoke of him as if he were a stray dog they had tired of feeding. He finally looked up, his gaze moving from Richard's cruel smirk to Eleanor's triumphant glare, and finally to Clara's mask of detached sympathy. He saw no regret, no sadness. He saw only relief. The relief of a burden being lifted. He was that burden. "You can sign them now," Clara urged. "Our lawyer is on standby. We can have this all settled by morning. Clean. Simple." He didn't move. His hands remained in his lap. The thought of the other envelope, the one in his pocket, was a strange, distant hum in the back of his mind, a mystery he had yet to solve. But this was a certainty. This was the end they had been planning for months, perhaps years. He thought of all the little cruelties, the casual dismissals, the jokes made at his expense that were never really jokes. He thought of the way they looked through him, the way they corrected his speech, his manners, his very existence. He had endured it all for Clara, for the woman he thought he loved, the woman he believed existed somewhere beneath the layers of Blackwood arrogance. He now saw with devastating clarity that there was nothing underneath. There was only more of the same. Unbeknownst to them as they sat in their climate-controlled fortress of wealth, a silent, powerful force was gathering just beyond their gilded gates. A fleet of 12 identical black sedans, their engines humming with quiet power, had pulled up along the tree-lined street. They were invisible in the twilight, their tinted windows reflecting the dying light of the sun. They waited, patient and implacable, for a command that would change everything. Inside, the Blackwoods were celebrating their victory. They were severing the last tie to a world they despised, a world of simplicity and honor they could never understand. They believed they were closing a chapter. They had no idea they were on the final page of their own story. Elias finally reached out, his hand steady, and pulled the envelope towards him. The paper felt slick and cold beneath his fingertips. He didn't open it. He simply held it, feeling its weight, the weight of 5 years of his life, dismissed with a check and a signature line. "Well?" Julian prodded, impatient. "Get on with it. We've got champagne on ice." Elias looked at Clara. "Is this what you want?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear. "It's what's necessary," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I need to move on with my life. I need someone who is my equal." The insult was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's knife. It was meant to be the final cut, the one that severed any lingering hope. And it was, but not in the way she intended. In that moment, something inside Elias shifted. The part of him that had been patient, that had endured, that had hoped, finally went silent. It was replaced by a cold, calm emptiness. It was the quiet before a storm. He stood up from the table, the chair scraping softly against the marble floor. He placed the divorce papers back on the table, leaving them untouched. "I see," he said. That was all. Just 2 words. Richard scoffed. "Is that it? No begging? No pleading? I'm disappointed." "Let him go, Father," Clara said, waving a dismissive hand. "He can sign them at his squalid little apartment. Just make sure you're out of the house by tomorrow morning, Elias. The locks will be changed." Elias turned and walked away from the table, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. He did not look back. As he walked through the grand foyer, past the portraits of Blackwood ancestors who stared down with the same disdain as their living descendants, he reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers closed around the other envelope, the mysterious one, the one that felt like it held a different kind of weight entirely. He stepped out into the cool night air. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, a sound of absolute finality. He was alone, cast out. But as he walked down the long, manicured driveway, he saw them, lined up along the curb, silent and imposing. A dozen black cars, their chrome accents gleaming under the gaslights that lined the estate's perimeter. They were not police. They were not a funeral procession. They were something else. A man in a perfectly tailored dark suit stepped out from the lead car and opened the rear door. He stood at attention, his posture immaculate, his expression unreadable. He was waiting for Elias. For the first time all night, Elias felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was confusion, yes, but it was threaded with a nascent, unbelievable spark of possibility. He walked towards the open car door, the strange envelope from his pocket now clutched tightly in his hand. His old life was behind him in that house of cold ambition. He had no idea what lay ahead, but as he slid into the plush leather interior of the car, he knew one thing for certain. The Blackwoods had made a terrible, terrible mistake. The car door closed with a soft, solid thud, sealing him off from the world he had known. The entire fleet pulled away from the curb in a single, synchronized movement, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside the mansion, Julian poured the champagne, the pop of the cork echoing Richard's boisterous laughter. They toasted to their clean, simple future. They were free. They were oblivious to the silent, powerful tide that had just turned against them. The history of his suffering was written in 1,000 tiny moments. It began the day Clara first brought him to this house. He remembered standing in the foyer, wearing his best, but still inadequate suit, while Eleanor looked him up and down as if inspecting livestock.
"A librarian," she had said, the word dripping with a venomous pity. How quaint. Richard had been more direct. He had shaken Elias's hand with a grip that was meant to crush, his eyes boring into him. "What are your intentions with my daughter?" he had demanded, not as a concerned father, but as a corporate executive assessing a deeply flawed investment. Elias, naive and genuinely in love, had spoken of his feelings for Clara. Richard had simply laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. From that day forward, he was never Elias. He was Clara's librarian, a curiosity, a phase she was going through. They treated his job as a hobby, his modest income as pocket money. They bought him expensive clothes he never felt comfortable in, then mocked him for wearing them awkwardly. They invited him to their exclusive clubs and parties, only to watch with amusement as he navigated their complex social codes, a stranger in a strange land. Clara, in the beginning, had seemed to be his ally.
She would defend him quietly in the car on the way home. "They just don't know you yet," she would say. But over time, her defenses weakened, replaced by a weary frustration. She began to echo their criticisms. "Couldn't you at least try to network, Elias? Or did you have to talk about medieval literature with Senator Jennings?" He was bored to tears. He realized, slowly and painfully, that she was not ashamed of them. She was ashamed of him. He was a reflection on her, and in their world, reflections had to be perfect. The cruelty escalated, becoming more open. Julian delighted in making him the butt of every joke, often about his financial status. At one Christmas dinner, Julian had gifted him a book titled Investing for Dummies, to the uproarious laughter of their assembled guests. Elias had smiled, accepted the gift, and quietly endured the humiliation. He told himself it was for Clara, but the woman he was enduring it for was disappearing, replaced by a cold, status-obsessed stranger who measured love in stock portfolios and social connections. Now, sitting in the silent, moving car, the city lights sliding past the tinted window, he finally allowed himself to feel the full, unadulterated anger he had suppressed for so long. It was a clean, purifying rage. He looked down at the envelope in his hand. It was time. With steady fingers, he broke the wax seal, which was stamped with a crest he didn't recognize, a stylized V intertwined with a gear. Inside was a single, thick sheet of paper and a heavy, ornate skeleton key. The letter was brief and written in an elegant, old-fashioned script. It was an invitation, or rather a summons. It requested his presence at the offices of Sterling and Croft, a firm he had never heard of, to discuss the final testament of his great-uncle, Arthur Vance. Elias barely remembered Arthur. He was his grandmother's brother, a reclusive figure the family spoke of in hushed, uncertain tones. He was an eccentric inventor, a tinkerer, who had disappeared from family life decades ago. The prevailing assumption was that he had lived and died in quiet poverty, a brilliant but failed man. The car continued its silent journey through the city, moving with a purpose Elias did not yet understand. He gave the driver the address from the letter. The man simply nodded, as if he already knew the destination. Meanwhile, back at the Blackwood mansion, the celebration was in full swing. "To the future," Richard toasted, his glass held high, "and to the removal of dead weight." "I can't believe how easy it was," Clara said, a genuine smile finally gracing her lips. "I thought he'd make a scene, cry or something." "The man has no spine," Julian sneered, refilling his glass. "He just took it. Pathetic." "He knows his place," Eleanor said with satisfaction. "He was lucky to have been in our orbit for as long as he was. Now, Clara, we can finally focus on finding you a suitable husband. I hear the Delacourt boy is back in town." Their conversation was a testament to their profound lack of empathy. They spoke of Elias's broken heart as a minor housekeeping task now completed. Their overconfidence was absolute, built on a lifetime of getting exactly what they wanted. They were convinced of their own invincibility, blind to the fragile foundations upon which their empire was built. Richard's construction company, Blackwood Holdings, was a monument to his ego, but it was dangerously over-leveraged. He had gambled everything on a massive new downtown development project, and he was desperately seeking a final round of financing to keep it from collapsing. He had an application pending with a discreet, highly respected private financial group, a lender of last resort known as the Argentum Group. He had been assured by his contacts that the loan was a sure thing. "Once the Argentum loan comes through next week," Richard boasted to his family, "we'll be untouchable. The Blackwood name will be synonymous with this city." He had no idea that the Argentum Group was merely one small arm of a vast global entity, an entity known as Vance Industries. The car carrying Elias pulled into a quiet cobblestone alley in the city's old financial district. It stopped before a pair of unassuming bronze doors, marked only with a small, polished plaque, Sterling and Croft. The journey to truth had brought him here, to a place that felt like it existed outside of time. The driver opened the door for him, and another suited man was waiting by the entrance. "Mr. Elias Vance?" he asked, his tone respectful. Elias was taken aback. He hadn't used his mother's maiden name in years. He had taken his father's name, Miller, after his parents passed. To hear Vance spoken aloud felt strange, like being called by the name of a distant ancestor. "Yes," he managed to say, "Mr. Sterling is expecting you. This way, please." He was led into an office that smelled of old books, leather, and lemon polish. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, and the walls were lined with leather-bound volumes from floor to ceiling. An elderly man with sharp blue eyes and a mane of white hair rose from behind a large oak desk. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice warm but formal. He extended a hand. "I am Alistair Sterling. I was your great-uncle's legal counsel and, I'm honored to say, his friend." Elias shook his hand, feeling completely out of his depth. "I don't understand. I was told this was about his will." "It is," Sterling confirmed, gesturing for Elias to sit in one of the plush leather armchairs facing the desk. Arthur was a unique man. He valued privacy above all else. He built a world for himself, and he has left that world to you. Sterling placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio on the desk between them. He opened it, revealing a cascade of documents, deeds, and corporate charters. Arthur never stopped inventing, Elias, Sterling began. His early patents in microprocessing and logistics algorithms were the foundation. He didn't sell them. He built on them, quietly. Through shell corporations and holding companies, he created what is arguably the largest and most influential private corporation on the planet, Vance Industries. Elias stared, speechless. This was impossible. It was a fantasy. Vance Industries is everywhere, and it is nowhere, Sterling continued, his voice low and steady. It owns shipping lines, satellite networks, biotech firms, and financial institutions. It operates in the shadows, a silent partner in the global economy. Arthur controlled it all from a simple, isolated workshop in the countryside. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a summary of assets. The numbers were staggering, a series of commas and zeros that his mind could barely process. It wasn't millions, it was billions, hundreds of billions. He had no children, Sterling said softly. He watched you from afar, Elias. He saw your quiet strength, your integrity, your refusal to be corrupted by the world you married into. He saw Vance. In his will he named you his sole heir. You are now the owner and chairman of the entire enterprise. The great revelation washed over Elias not as a wave of joy, but as a profound, earth-shattering shock. The world tilted on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, his own worthlessness was a lie. The divorce papers, the insults, the condescending pity. It all seemed so small, so pathetically insignificant now. The fleet of cars, Elias murmured, his voice hoarse. Your personal security and transport detail, Sterling confirmed with a slight smile. A small but necessary perquisite. We were alerted the moment the will was probated this morning. My instructions were to bring you here as soon as you were available. Available. As soon as he had been cast out by the Blackwoods, the irony was so thick he could taste it. Then a name caught his eye on one of the asset lists. A subsidiary financial firm, the Argentum Group. The Argentum Group, Elias said, his voice hardening. What is that? Sterling raised an eyebrow, impressed by his quickness. A boutique lending house specializes in high-risk, high-yield development projects.
Why do you ask? Richard Blackwood, Elias said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He's counting on a loan from them for his new downtown tower. He said it was a sure thing. A slow, knowing smile spread across Alistair Sterling's face. He understood immediately. Ah, he said. The ironic dependency. It seems Mr. Blackwood's entire future is unknowingly in your hands. The loan application is sitting on my desk, awaiting final approval from the new chairman. The mechanism of his power was suddenly, brutally clear. He was not just rich, he was in control. The shock began to recede, replaced by a feeling he had not allowed himself in years. A feeling of power. He looked at Sterling, the years of humiliation and pain coalescing into a single, sharp point of decision. The patient victim was gone. The sleeping giant was awake. I need to make a plan, Elias said, his voice no longer quiet or uncertain. It was the voice of a man in command.
I was hoping you would say that, Sterling replied, his eyes twinkling. Let's get to work. The decision point was a moment of absolute clarity. Elias sat in Sterling's office, the weight of his new reality settling upon him not as a burden, but as a mantle of responsibility. The years of being silenced had given him a profound appreciation for the power of a single, decisive action. He picked up a pen, a heavy gold-nibbed instrument that felt more like a scepter. He signed the document of acceptance, his signature once a meek and hurried scrawl, now firm and deliberate. Elias Vance. With that single stroke, the world shifted. Alarms, silent and digital, chimed in secure servers across the globe. Control of a vast, invisible empire was transferred. He was no longer the librarian. He was the chairman. "The plan must be surgical," Elias stated, looking at Sterling. "I don't want to crush them with a hammer. I want to dismantle their world with the very tools they use: money, influence, and the law. I want them to feel the walls closing in piece by piece." Sterling nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "A sound strategy. Revenge is a dish best served cold and legally airtight." They spent the next few hours in a focused strategy session. Sterling, the competent facilitator, laid out the myriad pressure points they could apply. He was a master of corporate warfare, and Elias was a surprisingly quick study. His mind, honed by years of organizing information and understanding complex systems in the library, grasped the intricate web of finance and law with ease. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. First, the Argentum Group loan. It would not be denied outright. That was too simple. It would be placed under an immediate, intensive, and deeply invasive review. Every contract, every invoice, every projection from Blackwood Holdings would be scrutinized. They would demand impossible levels of documentation, bleeding Richard's company dry with legal and accounting fees. Second, an anonymous but highly detailed tip would be sent to the financial regulators regarding certain creative accounting practices Richard had employed over the years. Sterling's forensic accountants had already flagged several questionable land deals. Third, Vance Industries, through a series of intermediaries, would quietly buy up the debt Blackwood Holdings owed to its other creditors. Then, all at once, they would recall those loans, triggering a liquidity crisis that Richard could not possibly survive. Fourth, and most personally, the mortgage on the Blackwood estate itself. Sterling discovered with a certain grim satisfaction that the mortgage was held by a small, regional bank that had been acquired by a Vance subsidiary a decade ago. It was a forgotten asset on a vast balance sheet, but it was about to become very important. The plan was designed to use the Blackwoods' own arrogance and financial overreach as the weapon of their destruction. "It is time to initiate," Sterling said, gesturing to a secure phone on his desk. "Your word is the command." Elias picked up the receiver. The first step was the gentlest, a subtle push to start the avalanche. He gave the order to the head of the Argentum Group. "Begin the review of the Blackwood application. I want it to be the most thorough audit in your institution's history. Spare no expense." He hung up. The first domino had been pushed. The next morning, Richard Blackwood was in his office, basking in the afterglow of the previous night's triumph. He was humming a cheerful tune when his private line rang. It was Mark, his contact at the Argentum Group. "Richard," Mark said, his voice strained and formal, a stark contrast to their usual backslapping familiarity. "We have a small issue with the loan." "An issue?" Richard laughed. "Mark, we've been over this. The paperwork is perfect. There's been a change in management at the highest level. The new chairman is a stickler for details. They've ordered a full forensic audit of your company before they can proceed. They're sending a team over this afternoon." The first domino had fallen. Richard felt a prickle of annoyance, but not yet fear. "An audit? That's ridiculous. It will take weeks." "I'm sorry, Richard. My hands are tied. They want everything from the last 10 years. Richard slammed the phone down. Disbelief was quickly turning to anger. It was an inconvenience, a bureaucratic hurdle, but his arrogance wouldn't allow him to see it as a threat. But then the second call came. It was from his chief financial officer, his voice trembling with panic. "Richard, we've just received a notice from the SEC," the man stammered. "They're opening a formal investigation into the Westfield land acquisition. They received an anonymous tip with copies of our internal memos." Now panic began to set in. This was no longer a coincidence. The Westfield deal was where he had hidden most of his creative accounting. To be investigated for that specific project meant someone had inside knowledge. Someone wanted to hurt him. He spent the rest of the day in a frantic storm of damage control, screaming at his lawyers, calling in favors that were suddenly not being returned. The doors that had always been open to him were now closing, one by one. By the end of the week, the cascade effect was in full force. Major suppliers, spooked by rumors of the investigation, began demanding cash on delivery. Two of his largest creditors simultaneously called in their loans, citing a clause in their agreements related to federal investigations. Blackwood Holdings was hemorrhaging money. The downtown development project, his legacy, ground to a halt. The stock price plummeted. The media, which had once fawned over him, was now circling like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Richard, Eleanor, Clara, and Julian were trapped in their mansion, the phones ringing incessantly with calls from angry investors and reporters. Their social circle had evaporated overnight. Invitations were rescinded. Friends crossed the street to avoid them. Their world was crumbling, and they had no idea who was responsible. Their panic curdled into paranoia and blame. Richard accused Julian of being reckless. Eleanor accused Richard of being a fool. Clara simply wept, a carefully constructed world shattered. From a quiet, secure penthouse suite overlooking the city, Elias watched the news reports. He maintained a facade of calm, observing the collapse from a distance. He did not feel joy or triumph. He felt a grim, chilling sense of justice, of a great wrong being righted. He ignored the dozens of frantic, pleading, and eventually abusive voicemails he received from Clara. They were the desperate cries of a drowning person trying to pull their rescuer under. But he was not her rescuer. He was the tide. He had instructed Sterling to execute the final step. A week after the divorce papers had been served, another crisp, cream-colored envelope arrived at the Blackwood estate. It was not from a law firm. It was from the bank. It was a notice of foreclosure. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. The arrogance was gone, replaced by raw, primal fear. They had lost their company, their money, and their friends. Now they were about to lose their home. In their desperation, they had only one person left to turn to, one person to blame. Clara made the call. "Elias," she sobbed into the phone when he finally, unexpectedly answered. "You have to help us. Everything is gone. Everything. I don't know who is doing this to us, but it's destroying us." Elias listened to her feigned helplessness, her voice filled with the same theatrical emotion she had used when she handed him the divorce papers. "Meet me at the house," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "Tonight, the whole family." A flicker of hope ignited in her. She thought he was coming to save them. She thought the librarian, the doormat, had come to his senses and would offer them what little he had. She had no idea she was summoning her judge. The setting for the final reckoning was perfect in its tragic symmetry. The grand dining room of the Blackwood mansion, the very place where his humiliation had been finalized, was now to be the stage for their downfall. The family was assembled, their faces a mixture of desperation and lingering, misplaced arrogance. They looked haggard, the stress of the past 2 weeks having stripped away their polished veneers, revealing the raw greed and fear beneath. The mahogany table was bare, the fine silver and crystal packed away by servants who had not been paid. They were waiting for Elias, whom they expected to arrive in a taxi or a ride-share, cap in hand, perhaps to offer a meagre portion of his librarian's salary to help them. They saw him as their last, most pathetic resort. The sound of engines interrupted the tense silence, not one car, but many. Richard went to the window, his eyes widening in confusion, and then alarm. The fleet of 12 black sedans had returned. They glided up the circular driveway and arranged themselves in a silent, intimidating formation, blocking all exits. Doors opened in unison. Suited, serious-looking men emerged, taking up positions around the property. They moved with the disciplined efficiency of a military unit. The front door of the mansion opened. 2 of the security men entered first, scanning the room before stepping aside. Then Elias walked in. He was not the man they remembered. The worn, ill-fitting jacket was gone, replaced by a bespoke suit of dark charcoal wool that fit him perfectly. His posture was different, erect, confident. The quiet deference in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, penetrating stare that seemed to see right through them. He was followed by Alistair Sterling, who carried a leather briefcase. The Blackwoods stared, mouths agape. This was a transformation so complete it was disorienting.
"Elias,"
Clara whispered, her voice trembling.
"What is this? Who are these people?"
Elias did not answer her immediately. He walked slowly around the table, his footsteps the only sound in the room. He stopped behind the chair where he had been served the divorce papers. He rested his hands on its back. 2 weeks ago, he began, his voice calm and measured, yet it filled the vast room with an undeniable authority. You sat here and passed judgment on me. You declared me worthless.
You dismissed my life and my love as an inconvenience. He looked directly at Richard. You built an empire on risky deals and deceit, and you thought that made you a king. You sneered at my honesty because you could not comprehend a world where value isn't measured in dollars. He turned his gaze to Eleanor. You judged me for my simple background, for the calluses on my father's hands and the humility of my mother. You worshipped at the altar of social status, blind to the moral bankruptcy of your own family. His eyes fell on Julian. You were the cruelest of all because your cruelty was born of insecurity. You mocked my lack of wealth because it was the only thing that gave you a sense of superiority. Finally, he looked at Clara. The coldness in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by a deep, profound disappointment. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I loved you. I endured all of this for you."
But what you didn't know was that you were trading diamonds for dust. You spent 5 years trying to change me into one of you, treating me like a broken thing that needed fixing. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the suffocating silence. "But what you really didn't know," he continued, his voice rising again, clear and sharp like a bell, "was that the bank you were begging for a loan, the bank that held the mortgage to this very house, the entire financial ecosystem that propped up your fragile world, was mine." The protagonist had revealed all. The shock on their faces was absolute. It was a dawning horror, the slow, sickening realization that the mouse they had been tormenting was in fact the lion. "No," Richard stammered, his face draining of all color. "That's impossible. You're a librarian, a nobody." "I am Elias Vance," he stated, the name ringing with power. "The sole heir to Vance Industries. The man you threw out of this house now owns it. The man you pitied now holds the fate of your entire family in the palm of his hand. The antagonist breakdown was immediate and spectacular. Eleanor let out a piercing shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. Julian, his face contorted with rage and disbelief, lunged across the table toward Elias. He didn't get 2 steps before 2 of the security men intercepted him, pinning his arms behind his back with effortless strength. He struggled, screaming obscenities, his bravado collapsing into a pathetic, impotent fury. Clara simply crumpled. She fell to her knees, her body racked with sobs. It was not the sorrow of a lost love, but the agony of a monumental miscalculation. "Elias, please," she begged, crawling towards him. "I didn't know. We can fix this. I still love you. I've always loved you." Her words were hollow, meaningless. He looked down at her, not with hatred, but with a final, chilling emptiness. The woman he had loved was truly gone, if she had ever existed at all. The final act began. Elias gave a slight nod to Sterling. The old lawyer stepped forward and opened his briefcase on the table. "Richard Blackwood, Eleanor Blackwood, Julian Blackwood," he said in a formal, resonant voice. "As you have been screaming at, threatening, and assaulting the chairman of the board of your primary creditor, you have violated several federal statutes." As if on cue, the front doors of the mansion burst open again. This time, it was not private security. It was police officers, their uniforms crisp, their faces grim. They moved with practiced efficiency. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and bank fraud," the lead detective announced, his voice booming in the suddenly silent room. Richard stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was utterly broken. The king was dethroned, his castle breached, his reign over. Elias watched as they were led away in handcuffs. Richard, defeated. Eleanor, hysterical. Julian, still snarling empty threats, and Clara, a weeping, shattered ruin, who didn't even look at him as she was helped to her feet and escorted out. He did not feel a sense of victory, only a quiet, profound finality. He had not sought revenge, he had sought balance. The scales of justice, so long tipped in their favor, had been righted. He turned and walked out of the house, leaving Sterling to coordinate with the authorities. He did not look back at the opulent prison that had held him captive for 5 years. He walked past the fleet of cars, out the main gates, and into the night, a free man. The epilogue of the Blackwood family was written in the cold, unforgiving language of the law. Their assets were seized, their company dismantled, their name forever stained with scandal and disgrace. Faced with irrefutable evidence, they each received lengthy prison sentences. They lost everything because they believed they were entitled to everything. Their final punishment was to be stripped of the status they had worshipped, becoming the very thing they despised, powerless nobodies. Elias Vance, on the other hand, did not embrace the lavish lifestyle that was now his for the taking. The mansions, the yachts, the private jets, they held no appeal for him. They were just bigger, more ornate cages. His reward was not the wealth itself, but the freedom and purpose it provided. He established the Vance Foundation, a charitable organization with a simple, powerful mission to provide legal and financial resources for people who had been wronged by the rich and powerful. He poured billions into creating a system of justice for those who had none, turning his own pain into a source of hope for countless others. He became a silent guardian, a check against the unbridled arrogance of people like the Blackwoods. Months later, he was visiting a small, community-run library that his foundation had saved from closure. He was in his element, surrounded by the quiet comfort of books, the scent of old paper and ink, a welcome balm. He wore simple clothes, and no one there knew he was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He was just Elias, a volunteer helping to shelve books. A woman with kind eyes and a warm smile approached him. She was the head librarian, a woman named Sarah. "Thank you for your help," she said. "We wouldn't still be here without the Foundation's grant." "I'm happy to do it," Elias replied, a genuine smile reaching his eyes for the first time in a very long time. "I've always believed a library is a kind of sanctuary." "Me too," she said. "Would you like to get some coffee after we close up?" It was a simple question, an honest invitation without agenda or artifice. It was the start of something new, something real. He had found his moral reward, not in a grand romance, but in a quiet, shared understanding. A victory lap was not a parade through the city, but a peaceful walk to a small cafe with a good person. He spent his days in purposeful work and his evenings in quiet contentment. He lived modestly, proving that true power lies not in what a person possesses, but in what they are willing to give. His story was a quiet testament to the idea that integrity is a form of wealth that can never be seized or spent. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or stock prices, but in character. The Blackwoods had been billionaires of arrogance and paupers of spirit. Elias Vance, the quiet librarian, had shown them and the world that the most valuable asset one can ever own is a soul that cannot be bought, a will that cannot be broken, and a heart that, even after being shattered, can learn to heal and build a better world from the pieces.